Hello, everybody, and good evening. We are delighted to host today Kenneth Hogg. Just a second. Kenneth is a program director at the Presencing Institute, where he is currently leading the Institute's work with several multilateral institutions, including the United Nations. Previously, Kenneth spent 30 years working in government and public service, mostly in Scotland, where he is a director at the Scottish Government. In that role, he introduced ULAB to Scotland in 2015 as a platform for community-led change and as a way of empowering communities to take action about things that matter to them. Thank you so much for joining us, Kenneth.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. Please tell us about ULAB Scotland journey, how it started, what problems did you try to solve, how it evolved, and where is it today?
Certainly, well, thank you. It's very good to meet you all. I'm based in Edinburgh in Scotland, and as Yuval said, I was and I still am a director in the Scottish Government. And I spent most of my career leading change in public services. And the ULAB journey in Scotland really began because we were looking for new methodologies which might be more effective for us to use in leading change, particularly in areas where we were not achieving the outcomes that we wanted to achieve by using traditional methods. For example, trying to tackle the growing inequality gap in Scotland in terms of social and economic inequality. And so I participated myself in the first ULAB run in 2015. And then I did that along with a few colleagues. And then together we wondered whether we could use ULAB itself as a mechanism to support change across communities in Scotland. And that's really what we did. We worked with the Presencing Institute to develop ULAB as a platform for community-led change. And some of the communities were focusing very much on specific places. Other communities were more communities of interest. So for example, people who were working in and were interested in health and social care, or people who wanted to tackle climate change, for example. And we simply convened organizations, drew their attention to ULAB, and then encouraged them to use ULAB, as I say, as a methodology to support them to bring to life changes about things that matter to them. And over the years, several thousand people have participated from Scotland. They have created many of their own hubs, a bit like this one. And now the Scottish Government no longer needs to sponsor it because it's taken on a life by itself. So people, there is in Scotland now a ULAB community, and those participants really organise themselves in terms of how they want to work with it.
Wow, that's wonderful. So what kind of support and assistance did the Scottish Government provide ULAB processes? Was it a top-down or a bottom-up effort?
Yeah, so so at that time I was inside government, and the approach that we took was to draw people's attention to ULAB. So we hosted a number of events to give people a taste of what ULAB would be like, and to encourage them to use it. We did not, though, spend any other money on it. So we didn't pay anybody to do ULAB, and we didn't fund any of the projects that came out of ULAB. The only other funding contribution that the government gave was our time, so my time and the time of my colleagues. One of the people that we used, though, we used as someone who would, how to describe it? Someone who would tell the stories coming out from communities. So she built a website and she encouraged people to post updates on what they were doing with ULAB on their website and to share their stories and experiences. And we found that was a really cost-effective way of sharing the learning coming out of ULAB. And there was one more thing that we did, which cost some money, which was we realized after a couple of years that the ULAB hubs which were most successful and which were thriving were hubs where the hub host, the organizer, had some training themselves in facilitation skills. And so we then organized some hub host training sessions for people to increase their skills in holding events like this, and principally to help them understand that one of the key skills is actually trying not to persuade participants of any particular point of view, but actually to hold open and create a space for them to use ULAB as they wanted to use it.
Okay. So what barriers did you encounter along the way, and how did you engage them? So in bringing something so unorthodox, I would say, as ULAB to an organization that is like a government that is probably rigid and not prone to such change.
There really weren't any barriers which prevented this thing from going ahead. I would say that we certainly experienced resistance in some organizations, including my own, because as you say, this is quite countercultural. But though those barriers really dissolved a bit over time as people experienced it. One of the things that I would say is that certainly in the UK, but also in other countries I know, the culture inside the civil service, which supports the government, is one which is one in which it's important that the civil service is politically neutral and that we're able to support whichever government is elected at the time. And so some colleagues, I think, feel that that means that their own personal views about issues are not relevant. And of course, as you know, the ULAB process talks about the self, and it talks about the link between myself and my work. And so initially, I think it can seem quite challenging to people who have been taught to believe that the self is not really a relevant factor in their work. However, I wouldn't agree with that description. And for me, although I've worked for governments of lots of different political persuasions over the years, irrespective of the political context, if you're leading change, you have to lead with your whole resources, with your whole heart. You have to be prepared to give of your whole self to the work. And so I don't personally find that to be a contradiction, but I know that some of my colleagues did.
Did you start small with like a couple of places and show the success of that process in order to persuade other places in the government to adopt ULAB? So
the approach we took was not to limit it only to the government. So we certainly publicized it inside the government, but we also immediately publicized it with our not-for-profit sector networks, with social enterprises, with companies, businesses who had some connection with government. Perhaps they were committed to strong ethical practices. We publicized it within public sector organizations and universities. And we just, one of the things that I had to learn to let go of is worrying about who actually shows up. And you know, the people who came were the right people. We learned to use our existing networks, and then just to go with the flow of who showed up, rather than trying to select particular organizations or parts of the government to begin with. And we learned a lot just by taking that approach and then working with whoever it was that came. We did get a very diverse range of people coming along, probably the most diverse group I've ever worked with, from private sector, public sector, from the third sector. And that was part of the attraction of the group that came together.
Okay. Can you tell us about the impact that ULAB Scotland had on the way the government operates? Yeah,
so in terms of the impact on government, I would say that it's mostly been an impact on working culture. So enough people have participated in ULAB to have a common language now. And so I would say that the change in the working culture has been more significant than the actual prototypes and initiatives which have come from the work. There are plenty of prototypes, but it's fundamentally begun to change attitudes towards something a bit innovative like this, to the point now where it's quite mainstream. So many of the concepts in ULAB, for example, levels of listening, are now quite commonplace within the Scottish Government. The impact outside government is also there too, but that's more where you would see different prototypes across Scotland and people who have brought to life different innovations.
Okay. Can you tell us about other countries where governments chose the ULAB journey as a tool for system change, and maybe they had a different approach?
Yes, I don't have a complete list of that, but I know certainly which countries have contacted us looking for advice and support. So I know that the government in Ireland have done that. The government in Netherlands have done that too. And also in different regions in the Netherlands, for example, the Brabant government has used the U methodology. I've had conversations with some US states, and I know that it's also of interest, for example, inside the European Commission. So we don't really keep a record of everybody who's using it. But what we are finding now is that, particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, more and more institutions are expressing an interest in this way of working, in addition to the more bottom-up grassroots movement, which this has always appealed to.
Okay. What advice can you give us in promoting ULAB-inspired processes in Israel on the scale of the entire country? Where should we start?
Well, I don't know. I think, as I say, the approach that we took was to use our existing networks. So not to try to create new networks, but to publicize what we were doing by writing to people who we already had a good relationship with. And those people came along, not because they knew much about it, they didn't, but they came along because we asked them and they knew us. So one piece of advice would be to use existing networks and relationships. As you know, ULAB as a methodology can be applied to almost any content. So it's not specific to any one sector or any one subject matter. And so it's something where I think you can safely invite people along to knowing that it will be an approach which can be relevant for them. But having said that, every country and area is different. I don't know. I mean, I would be really interested to know from any of you about your experiences so far with inviting different groups to engage.
Okay. What is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the ULAB movement?
Well, one of the things that the Presencing Institute did when the pandemic began was to create a new program which it called Gaia. And that was a new global program, which was a little bit like ULAB, but used some of the same methodologies. But the reason that we did that was because I think many people saw in the pandemic an opportunity to accelerate change. You know, we were already experiencing many organizations before the pandemic saying we can no longer operate the way we are in the new environment. Change is happening very fast, change in technology, political change, other sorts of cultural changes, and many organizations were feeling left behind. So there was already an appetite, I think, for new ways of working. We also had many individuals who were very excited about the innovation potential. However, the pandemic really accelerated all of that. And the pandemic also shone a spotlight on some of the inequalities in society. It shone a spotlight on the vulnerabilities and the cracks. And so that has really had the impact of accelerating and heightening people's attention on how can we use different methodologies in order to help us get different results. Now, this year's ULAB 1X is drawing to a close, and applications for 2X are now open, and that will run next year. So we will see what comes out of that. But overall, I would say there's a feeling that the methodologies which the Presencing Institute has been developing, although maybe a few years ago were seen to be a bit alternative, actually now they're being seen more and more as mainstream and actually essential if people are to be able to respond to the current context. And that's what's led, for example, to us working with the United Nations and other institutions who previously would never have engaged with something like this.
Which brings me directly to the next question. Can you please tell us about your activity in the United Nations?
Sure. So the Institute is working in a couple of areas. The one that I'm most closely involved with is called the SDG, or the Sustainable Development Goals Leadership Labs. And in practice, what that means is over the course of this year, we had been working with the senior United Nations leadership teams in 14 countries around the world. This builds on 2 pilots that were done in 2019 in 2 other countries. And the purpose of these labs, each lab is a 6-month process. We take them on a journey, a bit like ULAB, covers the same approach, but it's very much focused on action. So rather than teaching people theory, it's about creating a laboratory in which they can experiment with new leadership approaches, which are more responsive to the whole system. So looking at systemic leadership rather than just organization leadership. We're looking to encourage more collaborative leadership and also to generate new prototypes for action at the individual country level. So we're just finishing that first year of those 14 countries. In fact, I was co-facilitating in a lab in Syria earlier today. We will be finishing these countries in January, and then we'll be working in 10 more countries next year. And the countries next year the focus of that work will be the UN's humanitarian work rather than its development agenda. So there's a lot going on with the United Nations. Some of my colleagues are also working closely with one of the big agencies, specifically, that's the UN Development Programme. And that's more about a whole organization deep dive into the methods of TDU.
Okay. Can you pick one country you work with and tell us about the process there? What problems did you come to solve? Which sectors did you engage with? And which ULab tools did you use? Really get a little more into the details.
Well, I won't talk too much about a particular country just in order to maintain the confidentiality which we've committed to in these cases. But I can certainly talk about the tools we take and about examples of how they've used it. So in terms of tools, we are very much following a standard U process. So we run 6 sessions. This has all been done online this year for COVID reasons. Ordinarily, we would do it in person, but that was not possible this year. Each session lasts about half a day. So 6 half-day sessions with some work also being done in between sessions. And we take people on a U journey, and we follow the same process as you will do in ULab. So initiating and sensing and presencing and crystallizing, prototyping, and then bringing actions up to scale. The tools that we use are ones that you probably recognize. So we talk about levels of listening, levels 1, 2, 3, 4. We talk about the iceberg model of the M systems iceberg model, kind of getting below the waterline to the assumptions and beliefs and values which underpin people's behaviors. We talk about a kind of matrix of organizational development, 1.0 to 4.0, which relates to the levels of listening, I suppose. We use tools like 3D modeling. So we've done that online. It's possible to do it online. We use social presencing theatre, and again we've been innovating by doing that online this year. So all of the sorts of things that you would recognise actually from ULab or from other Presencing Institute programs. These are the tools that we're using in these leadership labs. And the sorts of things which countries have used this for are, in every case, it's to increase the UN's effectiveness in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Now that looks different in every single case because different countries have different priorities. But for example, some countries are choosing to work in specific places in their country. So place-based initiatives, usually to enable different agencies to work together more collectively and more effectively, rather than just each organization doing its own thing. Some countries have used this to engage with the diaspora of people who have left that country and gone around the world in order to fund and support activity in the country. One country I can think of used this program to change how it took financial decisions to a process which involves citizens more. So citizens deciding for themselves how to use financial resources in that country. A lot of initiatives are around tackling climate change. A lot are around engaging youth in different parts of the country in different ways, or tackling issues associated with youth. Some are about supporting businesses to thrive better in that part of the world. They're really different in every case. And for example, in Syria, you're dealing with a post-conflict, or indeed it's an ongoing conflict situation. The scope for the UN to work there is different compared to a country where it's been living in peace for a long time, and there are different sorts of issues there. So I hope that gives some sort of feel to the work that we've been doing.
You categorize the countries you've been working with as more on the developing side rather than the developed side?
Well, I can give you the names of the countries, and you can judge for yourself. I mean, they tend not to kind of use that language now, but so for example, this year we've worked in, see if I can remember them, Uzbekistan, Moldova, Serbia, Guinea, Tanzania. We've worked in El Salvador, in Guatemala, in Jamaica, in Mauritius and Seychelles. Where else? So, I mean, they are countries which tend to be lower income countries, but you know, they all have a very Bolivia. They all have a very different sort of social and economic makeup. I think the main common thread is that they're all countries where the UN leadership who applied for this wasn't something which they had to do. All countries were given the chance to apply for it, and it was oversubscribed by 2 or 3 times actually. They're all countries where the leadership wants to embrace new approaches. They're all countries where they've reached the conclusion that more of the same is not going to help the United Nations to achieve the results that it wants.
Okay. Now, before we open the floor for questions from the participants, is there any closing remarks, anything you would like to add?
Well, maybe just a kind of a more personal contribution. So, I mean, I'm now working with the Presidency Institute full time. I've been seconded from government, so the government have loaned me to the Presidency Institute. And I suppose that the reason why I've ended up where I am now is because in my own personal leadership journey, I had really learned from experience that when you're leading change, many of the traditional approaches are necessary, but they're not sufficient by themselves. And so program management, financial management, risk management, you know, using a business case for change, etc. These are all essential things, but they're not enough by themselves, because there's a missing piece in all of that. And the missing piece for me is to do with, as a leader, what's my personal capability to work through relationships, and to recognize that when you lead change, what you're doing ultimately is creating an emotional disturbance in the system. And what's my capacity to hold the anxiety that's prompted both in the system and in myself by creating that emotional disturbance. And it seemed to me that ULAB was an approach which addressed that. It talks about cultivating the interior condition. You know, there's this quote about the success of an intervention depends upon the interior condition of the intervener. And this idea of turning the camera back on the self is something which really appealed to me. And it's, you know, ULAB and the U methodology is something which recognizes the role of the self. It's, you know, that top-down change, even for governments, even when you have the ability to change the law, it still doesn't necessarily change people's behaviors. So, you know, you really have to be able to engage the intrinsic motivation of people and to get behavioral change. And to do that, you need to be able to relate emotionally and relationally to the people that you're trying to serve. And so that's really been the work which has interested me, and it's why now I'm really pleased to be having the opportunity to work alongside other organizations as they are going on the same journey.
Thank you so much. We're now going to allow questions from participants. If you have a question and you want to ask it yourself, please write it in the chat and we will give you an opportunity to speak. If you feel more comfortable writing the question in Hebrew, please write the question in the chat and we will translate for Kenneth. Shani, would you like to start?
יובל נראה לי שהוא ענה.
Okay, he said you already answered her question. Lirit?
Hi, good evening. My name is Lirit, and I'm the manager of the intersectorial collaboration unit in the Prime Minister's office in Israel. And I wonder if trust is a necessary condition to use the U method. And would you recommend this kind of work where there is a lack of trust between the participants?
Yes, I would recommend it in that circumstance. I don't think it's a precondition for using this approach, because one of the things that the approach does is to help the system see and sense itself and to build that trust. So to put it a different way, I guess in a circumstance where you have no trust, you could choose not to work there at all. But if there's something important that needs to happen there, the question is, how do you build the trust? And trust is not really built at the superficial level. In my experience, it's built with something beneath. And therefore, to get beneath the superficial level, first of all, you're talking about a different sort of conversation. It's a conversation where you're really asking, what matters to you? You know, for me to ask you, what matters to you? I'm having a conversation now with you, and my intention is not to persuade you of my point of view. My intention is to leave this conversation with a feeling inside me of what you care about and what matters to you. And those are the sorts of listening and conversation techniques which ULab and U methodology talks about and provides support around. But secondly, to have those sorts of conversations, you really have to build a container that is safe to have those conversations in. It's very hard just to jump straight into that and to kind of begin talking in that sort of way. So where you have a situation without trust, it takes time to build the container. And in many ways, when we're working with the United Nations, for example, that's what we're doing. We are building containers in which it's possible for people to have conversations which they could not have otherwise. And you know, there's a whole science around how to build a good container that's safe, where people are speaking authentically, and you know, the whole world of dialogue, you know, dialogue with a capital D, has been written, you know, about, and there's a lot that, you know, we draw on from that. But I would certainly not avoid areas because there is little trust. There are also other techniques which the organization uses, things like social presencing theatre, which you would be more careful about using. But actually, particularly when you can work in person, that's a great way of helping people see a system differently. And you know, underpinning all of this thinking is the idea that in order to change a system, you really have to shift the level of awareness or consciousness that people have of that system. It's not possible to get systemic change without getting that awareness shift. And you don't get that awareness shift until you tap into that, to those deeper levels of what people care about. I've used this in, sorry, just to add, I mean, I'm intrigued by your role. I mean, I've worked with colleagues in different parts of the Scottish and the UK government. And I mean, very often not having trust internally and externally is a very common situation. In fact, more so internally than externally. And so you're building these containers is just really important.
Thank you.
Very much.
Danielle?
Thank you, Yuval. Thank you very much, Kenneth, for this illuminating conversation. It's really helpful to share your examples. I want to take you back to what you shared before about the Scottish government. You said there was a change in the working culture. Can you say a bit more about that? Like if I would land in the Scottish government before and after, what would I see that was different in the atmosphere and the way things were done? If you can perhaps bring this a bit more to the ground of what changed in the way that the working culture changed in the Scottish government as a result of this work.
So I need to give a caveat that it's not really possible to attribute everything to ULAB. And of course there were other things, but it was one of the things that was happening around that time. I think that one of the biggest differences is the shift from doing to doing with. So governments, there's that famous saying that when your only tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Governments are very prone to using their top-down authority, and I mean the Scottish government actually isn't bad at that at all. In fact, I mean it's a relatively recently created government. It was created in 1999 when the Scottish Parliament was re-established, and it was designed to be closer to people. So actually, I wouldn't categorise the Scottish government as that. However, nevertheless, governments tend to feel that they're under pressure all the time to have the answer on everything. It's not really possible for a government politically to say, yes, we know something's happening over there, it's a problem, but we don't know what to do about it. Or it's not really our business, it's not our job to intervene on that. And so that tends to lead to a culture where governments try to establish an authoritative position on almost every issue. And I say the change that took place is one where it became far more respectable for government to position itself alongside other organizations and other communities and to co-produce outcomes. So the language of co-production became far more common in Scotland. You're building on the assets of communities and organizations. And so now, we would never introduce an approach, a policy, without a very high level of stakeholder engagement. And I don't just mean consultation, I mean stakeholders involved in the process of developing the policy. I can give you one concrete example, which actually began just before ULAB ran for the first time, but it certainly continued after ULAB. One of my roles in the government previously was to be responsible for policing in Scotland. And we led a reform of the police service in Scotland. We created a single national police force, where before there had been 8 regional police forces. And we also changed the purpose of policing to be more community focused. Now that was something which actually we did in a very collaborative way with the police service itself and with other stakeholder groups who had a strong interest in policing, like victims groups. It wasn't that government came up with an idea and consulted upon it and then legislated and made it happen. Those things happened, but the ideas were coming from a very collaborative process whereby I was asking the senior police officers, what matters to you? If you were to design, in fact, we did exactly this. We said, if you were to design your ideal policing system for Scotland, what would it look like? And they went and they designed it. And so we said, okay, how now can we get as close to that as possible within the resources that we have? And that sort of an approach where you're encouraged to work in a collaborative way is not the approach that other governments usually sponsor or often sponsor. Often, you know, the approach or the desire is to get a faster result just by driving a change through very quickly. So that's one of the ways. I mean, there are hundreds of small ways. Like, for example, now it's perfectly normal to begin a government meeting with a check-in and a check-out at the end. But these small changes are just tiny cultural changes which kind of add up to a bigger impact.
Thank you. Sophia? Mute.
Hi, my name is Sophia. Sorry, I work in the education ministry in the South District with ULab tools. And I want first to say thank you because we learn and you inspire us all with the things you do in Scotland, and especially because you have this research you publish and we can learn from them, and also the site. So thank you for that. It's an important source for us. And I wanted to ask what, I think you said some of it, but I still want to ask it like this. What are the essential components to succeed making this process nationwide, and if there are certain conditions to start with that they are necessary to succeed? Thank you.
So I think that one of the, well, I guess it depends what your place in the system is to begin with. But one of the preconditions that we learned, and I learned personally, was it really matters how I show up in this process. So working within government, one of the things that I did right at the beginning, in the very first gathering, the very first meeting, we had maybe 150 people in a big conference hall, and from lots of different sectors. And we were saying, there's this thing called ULab, you might like to use it. One of the things I had to say, or I felt I had to say, was whatever you do, the government will support you. We're not going to try to persuade you to change your mind. We're not going to try to say, please do this with it. You know, we are not going to try to influence how you use this within reason, as long as it's something to do with making Scotland a better place, you know, or the Sustainable Development Goals, for example. What matters to us is what matters to you. So use this process to bring to life change about things that you care about. And that can, I mean, it sounds strange to say it now, but that can make you feel quite vulnerable as a government leader, because, you know, governments are used to having a point of view on things. And in this case, what we're saying is, well, we're sort of agnostic on what you use it for, as long as it's generally to do with the betterment of the lives of the people of Scotland. And our role is to support you in that. So it's inverting the normal government role from top down to, you know, bottom up, or at least to be supporting people. And also, I'd say the second thing that we had to learn was governments don't like controversy. They don't like disruption. And I mean, I've done a bit of work in education too, and I mean, public services don't like controversy. They don't like bumpiness and messiness and people being upset, and they don't like bad headlines, and they don't like newspapers saying, you know, but actually this is messy work. And one of the things is about learning to tolerate that. and not to try to achieve consensus. So you really have, when you're using these tools in a system, you really have to keep open that level of discourse and disagreement long enough to get new ideas emerging out of it. It's not about achieving consensus and closing conversation down. So that's a second precondition, I think, that, once you start this, you mustn't try to steer it. If you ask people what matters to them and you encourage them to engage with that, you can't then say to them, well, I'm sorry, but I don't like what you care about. And, so these things tend to go off in lots of different directions, and that's a good thing. So I'd say that's a second precondition. I think that different sectors find this, experience this differently. So in my experience, the third sector, the non-profit sector, finds this very normal. So this is an approach which they, what's new here? It's, they enjoy it, it's useful, but it's not challenging at all. Same as social enterprise. It's the public sector that really struggles with it. And actually government struggles with it most of all, because it's so countercultural to many of the ways which we've learned to work within, especially in democratic processes. So for example, governments often talk about evidence-based policymaking. So the right thing to do is whatever the evidence says works. Well, that's true. And it's important to look at the international evidence base, for example, in education. But at the end of the day, we can identify high-performing countries around the world who you might point to. You might point to Singapore or parts of Canada or Finland, or you might point to countries with a good reputation. But you cannot assume you can transplant that into Israel or Scotland because of the cultural differences and the ways in which people work. So, evidence-based policy making only takes you so far. You have to engage with the people in the system who are actually engaging with it, and it's true in government systems. It's not enough just to try to transplant good ideas from one culture into the next. So how you show up is important. Not closing down controversy is important. Using your existing networks, I've mentioned that already, and not being too fussy about who gets involved. There are no wrong people. That's another thing I would mention.
Great. So
I'm sorry, Yuval, just another. So if the government in the top level is not fully believing in this process, it's impossible.
Well, I would say, do you need to tell them? Because what governments believe in is action. And certainly so I was a civil servant. I worked for government ministers who were elected. The approach that I would take is to say, I'm experimenting with something. Don't worry, trust me, and I'll come back and show you once we've got some results. So we don't need to involve government ministers in the nitty-gritty of the process. What they need to see is the results. And our experience was that within 3 months of ULAB beginning, for example, in the very first year, I remember inviting one of our most senior government ministers along to an event that we hosted in maybe December. So I think ULAB began in October one year, it finished in December. We invited along this government minister, and he had not been part of any of the process, but what he experienced just in spending 1 hour in this event was lots of different people queuing to grab the microphone to share with everybody else what they had done with this methodology. And he said, this is amazing, this is fantastic. I have no idea how you did it, but we want more of that enthusiasm. So, you don't need to involve everybody in everything. You need people who are able to provide some cover and say, in my area, we're doing a perfectly respectable methodology here. It's a bit different, and I'll let you know how we get on. So adopting that sort of experimenting culture. And, as you know, ULab can produce very quick results. So, fail fast, iterate, use it as an experiment, and then find out what's working, and then build on that, rather than making it a big deal. It can feel like a big deal when you're doing it, but if you describe it as that, I think it makes people nervous.
Great. So we have time for one last question from Josefa. You're on mute.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Josefa, and I facilitate groups of people before and after retirement using ULab in order to decide what is the next stage in their life now that they're after this huge threshold of, finishing work. So my question is, when working with teams or like with the UN agencies, are you involved in the stuff that happens before ULab begins, like informing the question? Because like when a whole team works on an issue, like are you taking any part of that, or are they coming with already a formed question or subject? Or how molded is it before you start working? Because it's such an open, process.
It's a really good question, and I've got two things to say to that. The first is that we absolutely do work with teams before the actual work starts formally. So typically we will have a lot of conversations with the leader, and we often ask them to form a small core group round about them. So people who are going to support this and support the leaders, hold this open throughout the process. So we build some trust there. We do interviews with them. We ask them what matters to them. We get them to tell about their current priorities. We get them, sharing with each other. We try to get a sense of what success might look like. So yes, we do engage up front. And sometimes that results in them saying, we are clear that we want to use the lab for this purpose, and that's fine. However, what's also very common is that even when people begin the process thinking, the issue I want to do is this, the process itself opens a realization that actually it's something else. So we absolutely try to keep open to changing partway through. Maybe the first thing is still valid, but maybe something else is valid too. Today, for example, I was having a conversation in the Syria lab, where they did have a clear idea of what they wanted to do at the start, but what emerged today, and we were just at the presencing phase, was that they were saying there are also other things we need to attend to, and those things are in many ways even more important than the first thing was, because they've come from a different place. They've come from that presencing moment, as you say, that threshold moment of letting come and letting go, and they're sensing into a future possibility in a way that lends real validity and importance to this new insight. So we always try to make room for those as well as the things which they began the process with.
Can you elaborate, just one thing, can you elaborate a tiny bit more about how open is the question? Like for me, if I'm working with people, I can always say, okay, what's the next step after you retire? But that's a very open question. Are you forming a more definite question, or do you leave it as open as a subject like that?
So very often going into the processes, and not just the UN labs, but that's true there too, people will say, we want to work on climate change, or we want to work on education, or we want to work on whatever. And often within that, they'll say, we want to work on this particular issue. So how do we, I don't know, close the inequality gap within education, whereby students in poorer areas perform less well, and how do we narrow that gap? Fine. But what often happens is in the process, they will say, actually, okay, we do have a prototype now on that, but what's changed more importantly than that are the relationships in this team. We're now working differently together, and that's applying to more than just that issue. Or they will say things like, actually we did want to tackle that, and we still do, but we've realized that we've got a problem with our workforce, which is just more important. Or they'll say, actually, the thing that I'm really upset about more than that is something else. So it's just being prepared to leave open, you know, when you take people through that presencing moment, however you do that, it's about remaining faithful to what comes up in that moment, because it's coming from the future. It's like leading from, it's not traveling from where I am now incrementally towards the future. It's reaching back from the future to where I am now and leading from that future sense of possibility.
Thank you so much. Thank you for coming to us from the future with the technology of social technology of the future. So on behalf of Nitzan and myself, on behalf of whoever showed up today, and on behalf of, I hope, many other people who will watch the recording, I want to really deeply thank you for coming and talking to us. And I wish you all the best in your endeavors in Scotland and the United Nations and wherever.
Thank you so much, Kenneth.
Thank you all very much. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and I would love to spend more time with you in the future. And good luck in your own enterprises as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
So we will be switching to Hebrew now.
כן, וואו. טוב.